special privilege it is for me to welcome all of you to Finn's first event, Poseidon's Illusion, Challenging the Way We See Marine Sustainability. It is also my great pleasure to welcome our two speakers this evening, Dr. Arthur Hansen and Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'll be speaking a little bit more about each of these gentlemen later on in the program, but what I would like to say now is from my experience working with Dr. Peterson and from what I've seen and heard about Dr. Arthur Hansen, these are two true Renaissance men, and we are very excited to have them here this evening. So before I get to our speakers, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Finn. Finn is not your conventional environmental organization. All of our executive members have a background in psychology as opposed to engineering, environmental studies, or biology. Now this leads to some special benefits that we have. I'm going to tell you about three different, the special benefits are that we can use our knowledge of the brain, emotion, and behavior to develop innovative angles on how to publicize the problem of marine life decimation. So I'm going to tell you about three different psychological concepts that we've tried to integrate into our advertising over the past couple months. So the first is that images of cute animals induce positive emotion and narrow attentional focus. That's probably not what you were expecting to see. Fred the fish doesn't quite do it for you, does he? So we had to be a little bit creative. We had to approach this problem that fish and their appearance don't really draw that fuzzy emotion from you that you really want to help them out. That's probably a lot better. So we took the approach that, I don't know if any of you have pets, but you know that when their food bowl is full, they're pretty happy. Now, if you take that food away, like for example, if fish were to suddenly be gone, which is one of their food sources, not so happy. Now you add a slogan to it, and there you go, that's one of our first advertisements. So the second concept that I'm going to go over is one that we've actually borrowed from social psychology research, and that's something that's called the door-in-the-face technique. So the gist of this technique is that you initially make a large request from an individual that's probably going to be shut down. That's probably going to be the answer that you're going to get. So then you follow up this request with a much smaller, more reasonable one. Of course they're going to come. So the reasoning behind that is that an individual is more likely to agree to the second, more reasonable request when it is preceded by an outlandish one, versus had it been asked on its own. So the final concept that I'm going to go over, it's going to require a little bit of background knowledge, which I'm going to discuss, and it's an angle that we decide to take about the health benefits that you receive when you ingest fish or possibly fish oil. Now, I imagine that many of you know who this is. This is Psy. He's best known for his dancing Gangnam Style. If you don't know him, you can ask your students on Monday or potentially your children tonight. They're very familiar with him. So Gangnam Style is essentially, it refers to a district in Seoul, South Korea. And the people who live there, they have a very affluent lifestyle. And they achieve this wealth pretty much overnight. They didn't exactly have to work for it. So because of this, it's often related to this aphorism. With great power comes great responsibility. Because of the fact that they didn't have to work for their wealth and it came overnight, they don't really have a sense of their social responsibility. So we decided to take this and relate it to fish. When it comes to eating fish, we're all living Gangnam Style. Basically, what this means is that we were born into a world that has oceans that were full of this great resource. We were rich with fish. But because of this, we didn't really develop at the same time that sense of responsibility that we have to maintain our oceans and maintain their sustainability. So now to the psychological concept. This aphorism that we decided to use, it wasn't enough. We wanted to take it one step further. That's what we're always doing. We're really, really pushing. So When you eat fish, it helps with early brain development and the prevention or treatment of brain-related problems. So again, referring to the food chain, like we did before, how cats, they eat fish, we had to think, who really wants a good, healthy brain? Zombies. Zombies eat brains, and they want them to be good as opposed to unhealthy. And we're lucky because in Toronto we have a lot of zombies. So you add that to the fact that people like to dance Gangnam Style. And now, just to summarize and make sure that you're following me, we have zombies who need good brains, and because of that, they need fish. You add that to dancing Gangnam Style. You add that to the aphorism that we developed about fish and how we're all living Gangnam Style. And the next logical progression that we were going to do, zombies dancing Gangnam Style wearing fish shirts with the catchphrase at the end. Now you'd be surprised to know that we were actually beaten to the punch. There is already a zombie that dances Gangnam Style, and he does a pretty good Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley as well. So we had to ditch this idea. But on a serious note, this truly has been one of the most rewarding but challenging projects I have had the opportunity to work on. You soon learn that 1/10 of the battle is pulling together the correct data. The rest is communication and finding ways to make people listen. Something that I quickly learned while growing up and trying to get my parents to see things my way is that everyone has a different perspective and way of communicating. Though we all may speak a particular language, when it comes to explaining a problem or inspiring action, different things make sense and push different people. For some, it is art, such as image or dance. For others, it is an equation or a graph. For some, it is comedy, and even others, reading and logic. It is Finn's goal to use all of these mediums to raise public awareness about the decimation of marine life. Then, with the help of every believer, we want to inspire change in Canada's ocean management policy. Now, this is something that we do not plan to do by ourselves either. We hope to create links not only between departments within the University of Toronto, but also between all forms of post-secondary institutions across Canada, the arts and design schools, as well as science and research institutions. In this way, we can reach out not only to communities geographically across Canada, but also to the communities of like-minded reasoning. So on that note, I would like to introduce now our first speaker, Dr. Jordan Peterson. He earned his PhD in psychology at McGill University, and following his postdoctoral fellowship at McGill's Douglas Hospital, served as a professor of psychology at Harvard. 4 years later, he came to the University of Toronto, where he is a professor with two main areas of study, the psychology of belief and the assessment and improvement of personality. His work has been supported by all three of the main Canadian granting agencies, as well as the Rotman Business School Centre for Integrative Thinking. He has authored and co-authored over 70 scientific articles, including one book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, and soon to be a second, 42. Dr. Peterson holds multiple orator and teaching awards, including a nomination for the Levinson Teaching Prize at Harvard in 1998, and nominations by TVO as one of Ontario's best university lecturers each year from 2005 to 2008. In addition to his clinical practice, Dr. Peterson serves as a business consultant, an executive coach for senior partners of large law firms in Toronto, and is the vice president of a personality assessment and remediation company. He is also a frequent guest panelist on TVO's The Agenda, and a popular source of information for other TV shows, radio programs, and printed articles. Please welcome a man who through the years has inspired thousands of students to pursue their dreams and instilled the belief in the members of Finn that we can accomplish anything, so why not immediately start trying?
Thanks, Christine. So, anyways, it looks to me like that's what we're facing over the next few decades. It's kind of an evocative phrase. The sea seems empty anyways, because of course you can't see what's beneath the surface, but before the depredations of people. It was an amazing resource. I started to learn about this, and I'm going to walk you through what I learned because I think it's a reasonable way of introducing everyone to the basic elements of familiarity that are necessary to understand what's happening in the oceans. I guess sometimes I've noticed that it's useful when you're teaching people not to know a lot more than your audience does, because if you start to develop great expertise in an area, then you forget what people don't know, and it's easy to speak about things that aren't easy to follow. And you shouldn't have any problem with that tonight, because, as I said, I'm a relative beginner in this area, and a lot of the things I learned were really quite obvious things, especially in retrospect, but I didn't know them. I got an opportunity to start familiarizing myself with this particular issue because I was fortunate enough to work with the Canadian subcommittee that the Secretary General of the UN set up about 3 years ago. And the Secretary General was interested in producing a report, and this is the final report, Resilient People, Resilient Planet. And it was sort of a follow-up to the 1992 Brundtland Commission, which was the first real worldwide attempt to bring some order and intelligence to ecological issues with a certain degree of success. Now that was followed up in Brazil in 2012 with an ecological/economic meeting that wasn't precisely a raving success. But this was the document that served as lead up to the 2012 20th anniversary of the Brundtland Commission. And the reason I was asked to serve on this committee was because the people who ran it, it was headed by Jim Balsillie, who ran RIM Corporation. The people who ran it didn't think that the underlying narrative of the report was appropriate for the modern day. And in some sense, it sort of felt like it had been written in 1984, which is actually quite a long time ago now. There was a lot of North versus South ideology in it, an ideology that's less relevant now that the less developed world is developing at an incredible rate, and there was a lot of left versus right ideology in it, when it seems more appropriate in the modern world to note that problems of this magnitude have to be solved by everyone regardless of their political orientation. And there was a lot of underlying implicit idea that the planet would be better off without people on it, which is not a position that I hold, and which I also think is a dangerous one to promote. And so I had the opportunity to rephrase the underlying structure of the document to some degree, to the degree that that's possible when you're working with multiple committees, but at least in part to stress some of the really great things that people have accomplished over the last 2 decades. And I want to start with that because it's necessary to put things in context. You know, I mean, we're assaulted by apocalypses all the time. I mean, I'm 50 years old now, and I mean, I've lived through at least 5 probable apocalypses, none of which thankfully occurred. And the problem with that is that it's easy to get apocalypse overdose, and in a sense, and to feel that you're assaulted by catastrophes from so many directions that the only logical thing to do is to ignore them. Now, I don't think that's true, because people have been getting their act together in multiple dimensions in quite remarkable ways, and so I'll detail some of those. In 1970, approximately 900 of the 3.5 billion people currently alive were hungry. The same number were hungry in 2008. However, the population had doubled during that period, so the proportion of hungry people halved during the most rapid expansion of human population in history. That's pretty remarkable, and it's not what people predicted, because the most dire environmental estimates in the late 1960s were predicated on the idea that by the year 2000, with the 6 or 7 billion people that were likely to be around, that there would be widespread starvation. And quite the contrary, people are better fed than they ever have been. In fact, there are more obese people in the world now than there are hungry people, which is really some kind of accomplishment, even though it's, you know, damning in a sense with faint praise. In 1981, about 52% of the world's population, 2 billion of 4.5, lived under the new World Bank poverty cutoff estimates of $1.25 a day. By 2005, that figure had decreased to 25%, and current estimates indicate that this figure is moving downwards at 2% of the total world population per year. Assuming 1.5%, which is conservative, the percentage below the poverty cutoff by now may have fallen to 15%. So that's a staggering achievement. The proportion of people living in poverty in East Asia and the Pacific has decreased by more than 50% since 1990, and this after rates had already halved in the previous 2 decades. Lifespan has increased dramatically. We have the spectacle in Africa now where I read in The Economist a week and a half ago that there are enough cell phones in Africa now so that 3 out of 4 people have them, and that's brought tremendous economic advantages to the people of Africa, contributing in part to the fact, which is almost impossible to believe, that the sub-Saharan African countries are now the fastest growing economies in the world. And so we're actually in a position, maybe for the first time in human history, where the only reason for starvation and hunger is political. So there's also been a staggering decrease in the number of anti-democratic or totalitarian states over the last 30 years. And it's partly because, in some sense, the whole idea of totalitarianism, whether it's on the left or the right, has lost its essential validity. Even the dictators themselves don't believe in the justifications they put forward for their abuse of power. And so what we've seen happening is horrible governments toppling one after another at what's really a miraculous rate. And that's all on top of the collapse of the Soviet Union and, the demolition of the Iron Curtain and all these things that for someone my age seem absolutely miraculous, not to mention, of course, the opening up of China. So, 3 cheers for the human race. It's pretty damn good that we've managed to put those sort of successes together. I mean, the UN had a millennium goal in 2000 to cut poverty in the world by half by 2015. They figure they hit that by 2011. So, these things are just, any person with any sense would regard that fundamentally as miraculous. It's massive economic productivity increases combined with massive population increases. I mean, so, it's not all gloomy. And so the UN and the initial UN report had virtually none of that in there. And I think that's a real mistake, because human beings, we've got waste management problems and there's a lot of us and we eat a lot, but, we're also trying as hard as we can to put things together as fast as we can. All things considered, there's always unreasonable people, but, for a bunch of creatures that only separated from chimpanzees 7 million years ago, we're not doing that bad. We didn't even understand oceanic ecology at all, except into the last 100 years. So we are trying to learn things as fast as we can. So, credit where credit's due. And there's a lot of credit due. And it's also really important not to make the case that everything's terrible, because it's a low resolution, thoughtless case. You have to concentrate on things and differentiate between them, so you know the difference between things that are problems and things that aren't. Because if everything's a problem, well, you might as well just sit at home and drink gin, because there's nothing you can do about it. But, the truth of the matter is that when we put our minds together, we can actually fix things pretty fast. And part of the necessity that precedes fixing things is to become informed enough so that you understand, at least to some minimal degree, what you're talking about. And so I'm hoping that to some minimal degree I know what I'm talking about, and if I'm not, I'm hoping that Arthur Hansen, who's a real expert on these matters, will correct me. So, well, what's still bad in the world? Well, corruption's still bad, and it's a cause of suffering that's definitely under-addressed, I think often for political reasons. And there's no doubt that we have a pollution problem. And I would say that's basically a waste management problem. And it's the kind of problem that faces really any creature, because all creatures have to deal with their waste. And of course, maybe we produce a bit more of it than we should because we're pretty smart and we build lots of things. But it is part and parcel of living in a universe where the primary force is thermodynamic deterioration. It's a hell of a thing to fight. So it's not because we're innately evil that we produce byproducts. It's because life is very complex and difficult to sustain, and we want to live longer, and no wonder, and we'd rather that everyone didn't suffer any more than they had to, and that's probably a good thing too. So we've got our reasons. However, when I was going through all of this, there was a couple of things that really stuck out for me, and one of them was the oceanic problem, because, well, there was a bunch of reasons. The first was because I thought the data indicating that what we were doing was damaging was really incontrovertible as opposed to many of the issues that you hear about from time to time or maybe constantly. It's very, very clear that we're overfishing and overfishing dramatically, and that we're doing other things to the oceanic environment that are definitely not in our medium or long-term interest, to say nothing about the creatures themselves. I also thought that the oceanic management problem was an appropriate problem to consider from a more practical perspective. I mean, I thought a lot about global warming, and I'm not going to talk much about global warming because that isn't what I'm here to talk about, but one of the things I did realize about global warming rapidly was that the error in the estimates of the likely warming of the planet over the next 60 years are so large, even if they're done by the best scientists, they're so large that even if we stopped using anything that produced carbon dioxide now, we would never know if that actually helped. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, how in the world are you going to sell something like that? Even if it works, you can't tell if it worked. Plus, you know, the time course of improvement is over multiple decades, and everyone uses hydrocarbon energy, so it's a real killer to try to address. It seemed to me that it was more logical in some ways to focus on problems that had a shorter horizon and somewhat more immediate returns, because that way you can tell if all the effort that you're putting into solving the problem is actually having some sort of positive consequence. And the oceanic management problem seemed to fit into that too. It wasn't intractable. It wasn't a problem that was rapidly disappearing on its own like world poverty seems to be. I don't think you could speed that up, the disappearance of poverty, any more than it's been sped up. It's sort of hit maximum improvement. So it sort of falls into the category of solvable problem with potentially proper interventions. The other thing is, as far as I can tell, there's no losers to fixing this. You know, the oceanic mismanagement problem is of such magnitude, with the exception of certain species, that if we keep up our rate of fishing for the next 20 years, there's not going to be an awful lot left. And that's not going to be very good for the large corporations that, you know, that make their economic living off the oceans, and it's going to be real hard on us if we want to eat. And then, of course, there's the loss of the beauty and the diversity, and also the potential to truly transform the nature of the ecosystems of the ocean in a way that really won't be good. I mean, our planet's covered 2/3 by oceans, and that's a lot. And like, we're messing with them in a really serious way. And part of the reason for that is, you know, fish are fish, and they've got scales, and they're not that brainy. And we're going after them with like 21st century technology. You know, we use planes to spot them, and sonar to find out where they are, and you know, like ultrasonic mapping to check out the structure of the bottom of the ocean, and massive nets, and like those bloody things don't have a chance, and that's not so good, you know. It's inappropriate use of technology. Now, there's some real reasons for it. Now, as I said, I'm a layperson. I read a lot. I probably read about 40 books and a whole pile of papers on this topic and others, and some of them were really helpful, and these are some of them. The End of the Line is a great book, and these are very straightforward books to read. They're very engaging. Unnatural History of the Sea, I love that. The Most Important Fish in the Sea, that's about this little herring-like fish that lives off the Atlantic coast called the menhaden, which is kind of an inedible, oily beast of a herring, and it at least one time numbered in the hundreds of billions. It might have been the most plentiful animal on the surface of the planet, maybe outnumbering all the other fish. And it's at the very bottom of the food chain, and people can't really eat it, but everything else does. And one of the things we're doing with the menhaden, which seems, you know, really not all that bright, is vacuuming them up like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, and grinding them into fish fertilizer and spreading them all over the ground, you know, when we have all sorts of other ways of making fertilizer. And so, you know, we're stripping the whole bottom of the food chain out of the Atlantic coast, and a lot of that seems to have to do with political corruption in the eastern US states. So it's a remarkable book. Cod, I love that too. Mark Kurlansky's a great author, and you know, reading about the devastation of the cod fishery on the East Coast is just enough to make the, you know, bottom fall out of your heart, because it was so damn dumb. You know, everybody knew it was coming, and people pretended that it wasn't, and we devastated a resource that was really the pride of the country, and also a mainstay of the world economy for 500-600 years, you know. So it's a great book, and I'm showing you those books because that's source material for a lot of what I'm going to tell you. Now, the first thing I learned about the oceans was that the oceans aren't that big. Not when you're talking about what lives in them, because the oceans actually have two kinds of structure, and one structure they call the Pelagic Zone, and it only extends 50 miles from the shore. So it's like this little skinny, offshoot of the continents, essentially. Maybe you know it as the continental shelf, and it's only about 500 feet deep. Now, that's important because it's only that deep, light can get to the bottom from the sun. And so you need light for things to grow, especially plants, and if plants can't grow, then the animals can't eat anything, and then there aren't any animals. So it turns out that all the life, fundamentally, with a bit of an exception, is within 50 miles from shore. And so, and in these areas that are only, 500 feet deep or less. Now, if you look at this map, the light blue areas there are the Pelagic Zone. And, they look pretty big up in the Arctic. Remember, this is all stretched out because it's not a very intelligent projection. But all the dark blue stuff, man, that's deep. 2 miles deep on average, and it can be 11,000 feet deep in places. And the problem with that is it's really dark. No light gets down there. It's really cold. It's not much above freezing. It's really high pressure, like higher pressure than the surface of Venus. And so it's not that hospitable for life. There's not a lot around there. And, the problem with that, at least in part, is, well, A, that's most of the ocean, and B, it's mostly empty. But because it's cold and dark, the things that do live there, well, they're not very well understood. But they also don't grow very fast. So if you do fish them, and we are fishing them, then, you fish them and it's like harvesting the trees that grow up in the Arctic, They take forever to grow back. So, and as we fished out the Pelagic Zone, which we're doing at a fairly rapid rate, we've increasingly turned to the Neritic Zone, especially with trawlers that can now reach 2,000 meters down to the bottom of the ocean. And, it's not high quality food, generally speaking, but the problem too is we don't understand it well, and it seems quite easy to devastate. So, anyway, so that's a useful thing to know, is that there really isn't that much food-bearing ocean, and that a lot of the planet is sort of covered by water that's too dark, deep, and cold to be of a lot of use. Here's the things that really broke my heart, I think, reading this. Because one of the things that these books taught me was just how much there was before we took it. And like I said, I'm not anti-human in any way, but the way this struck me was that it was a catastrophic aesthetic and spiritual loss, a loss of the absolute bounty of the planet, and the sort of thing that it evokes in the viewer or the experiencer, the same sort of thing that maybe is evoked when you look up at the sky and see the vast array of stars sort of spread out before you. It's the magnificence of nature, and we're denying ourselves the privilege of experiencing that increasingly. So let me tell you what it was like when the Europeans first came to North America. And you want to remember that this is even after the Native Americans had done a fair bit of fishing, and also after the Europeans had already pretty much fished out their waters completely. Sturgeon. Well, sturgeon's a prehistoric fish. It's been around about 60 million years or so, and they get really long and big. They get so big you have to haul them out of rivers with oxen. They can weigh 1,200 pounds. And there are hardly any on the Atlantic coast anymore. I don't know if there are any. There's some still in northwestern Canada. They live in the Fraser River, for example. This was the Potomac River in 1760. Potomac, I guess. Sturgeon and shad are in such prodigious numbers that in one day, within the space of 2 miles only, some gentlemen in canoes caught about 600 of the former, that was sturgeon, with hooks, which they let down to the bottom and drew up at a venture when they perceived them to rub against the fish. And of the latter, shad, about 5,000 had been caught in one single haul of the net. So it was possible to catch 600 sturgeon in one day. I don't imagine that 600 sturgeon are caught now in the whole world in a year. Alewife or herring in 1728, this is from William Byrd. When they spawn, all streams and waters are completely filled with them. And one might believe, when he sees such terrible amounts of them, that there was as great a supply of herring as there is water. In words, it is unbelievable, indeed indescribable, as also incomprehensible what quantity is found there. One must behold oneself. There are medieval pictures of the herring run near the coast where people would put a halberd, which was a kind of double-headed axe on a pole, in the water, and it would stand up because there were so many herring around that the herring themselves were packed in so tightly that the thing would stay up in the water. William Wood. The halibut is not much unlike a plaice or turbot, some being 2 yards long and 1 wide and a foot thick. The plenty of better fish, so they had plenty of better fish than halibut when the Europeans first came to North America, make them little esteemed except the head and fins, which stewed or baked is very good. These halibuts be little set by, while bass is in season. Thornback and skates is given to the dogs, being not counted worth the dressing in many places. You should also know that when the Europeans first came to North America, salmon and lobster fell in the same category. So there were laws in New England about how many lobster you could feed convicts or slaves in a week, because it was, it was like feeding them bugs as far as the New Englanders were concerned. And salmon was so plentiful, it was basically a junk fish. So these things that we now regard essentially as delicacies, especially wild salmon, were there in absolutely unbelievable numbers. So I lived in Boston for a little while, and I used to go up to the coast. There was a place there called Cape Ann, which was up where the whaling communities used to be, because it was a big whaling area. And we used to go to this beautiful beach that was like 7 miles long and 300 yards wide, and it was absolutely pristine, gorgeous place. And the history of the area recounts what happened to the beach after nor'easters. And a nor'easter is like a hurricane, except it's the northern version of a hurricane. They said after a good nor'easter, which happened around Boston pretty often, the beach there would be covered with shellfish and other fish 3 feet deep and 100 yards wide and 7 miles long. So that after there was a nor'easter, the whole area would reek for months because of all the rotting fish and shellfish. I went to Cape Ann, to the beach, one time after a nor'easter and walked about 3 miles. I found 1 starfish, an empty lobster trap, and a half-dead horseshoe crab. And that was it. And normally walking on that beach, there was nothing at all. So that's the degree to which the area had been essentially devastated. Priest Andre Bernaldez with Christopher Columbus. Throughout that voyage, they saw that there were many turtles and very large. But in those 20 leagues, they saw very many more. For the sea was thick with them, and they were of the largest, so numerous that it would seem that the ships would run aground on them, and were as if bathing in them. The Indians value them highly and regard them as very good to eat and healthy and savory. Figure there were something on the neighborhood of 200 to 400 million turtles in the Caribbean, and they're pretty much all gone. Sea otters. From San Francisco to the Santa Clara estuary, the ground appeared covered with black sheets due to the great quantity of otters which were there. The disappearance of otters, because they were almost completely wiped out, eliminated kelp forests because the otters ate the urchins which grazed on the kelp. And removing the kelp forests wiped out Steller's sea cow, which was a 30-foot marine animal similar to the manatee, except much larger. It was wiped out along with hunting, along with habitat and hunting, 28 years after its identification by Europeans. From California, late 1850s, 1,000 gray whales a day passed along the shore between December 15th and February 1st. So there are valid reports from all over the world before the whaling industry really kicked in of whales being about as common as porpoises are now when you see them swarming around the fronts of boats. So there were whales absolutely everywhere. So you imagine that 1,000 a day for basically a 3-month period. So herring, 1776. When the main body has arrived, its breadth and depth is such as to alter the very appearance of the ocean. It is divided into distinct columns of 5 or 6 miles in length and 3 or 4 broad, while the water before them curls up as if forced out of its bed. Sometimes they sink for the space of 10 or 15 minutes, then rising into the surface, and in great weather reflect a variety of splendid colors like a field bespangled with purple golden azure. The whole water seems alive, and is seen so black with them to a great distance that the number seems inexhaustible. There were so many turtles swimming towards the islands in the Caribbean that when the sailors used to get lost in the fog, if they were close enough, they could sail to land by hearing the turtles splash in the water. Along with the herring schools of great magnitude, there were immense number of predators because, of course, the herring is a primary food for other fish, and so there were massive schools of sharks and so on that would come along and feed on them. Haddock from Goldsmith in 1810. They annually visit the British coast in shoals that sometimes extend along the shore 100 miles in length and 300 miles in breadth. In 1855, 43 fishing schooners from Beverly, Massachusetts caught more cod south of Nova Scotia on the Scotian shelf, so these are just sailing ships, than the entire Canadian fleet caught there in 1999. 6 years later, 34 schooners landed more cod on the Maine coast between Penobscot Bay and Grand Maine than were caught in the entire Gulf of Maine from Cape Cod to Canada in 1999. So, well, if you read those books that I showed you, they're just full of accounts of precisely that sort. It makes painful reading, you know. There's, Kurlansky also wrote a book called The Big Oyster, which is about New York, and he talked about what Chesapeake Bay used to be like. And Kurlansky claims that the average sized oyster 300 years ago was as big as a dinner plate and had to be cut into 4 pieces before it could be water. And so Chesapeake Bay was an absolutely staggering masterpiece of natural plenty, and it's pretty much been reduced to nothing as well. So it makes pretty painful reading. And one of the things I also learned about this, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is, you know, when you hear estimates of fish stock depletion, you hear things like 95% since the beginning of the 20th century. But lots of these writers claim that the fish stocks had already been reduced by 95% or more by the beginning of the 20th century. So we're looking at a 95% reduction in a 95% reduction. So, you know, that kind of hurts. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is called the tragedy of the commons, and the tragedy of the commons is, well, imagine that there's a field on which anybody can graze their sheep. Well, the logical thing to do is to get your sheep out there and let them eat all the grass before the next guy gets his sheep out there and eats all the grass, right? And so the tragedy of the commons is that when there's no fixed ownership of a resource, it makes sense economically for the person who gets first access to the resource to take as much of it as they can, because anything they leave, at least in principle, is going to be taken by someone else. And historically, until at least 1978, the open ocean was only 7 miles offshore. That's where the national jurisdiction ended, and the rest of the sea was regarded as, you know, free territory in a sense, so people could take whatever they wanted. And, you know, you can see that as a legal and a structural problem. So that's one of the main contributors. Another contributor right now to the continued decimation of the world's fish stocks, and one of the things that makes regulation difficult is what's being described as technological creep. So you might say, well, you know, maybe you can limit your boat to 40, the boats that are allowed to fish to 40 feet in length or something like that, instead of these massive factory boats that go out and, you know, sit on the ocean for months and vacuum up everything in their trail. The problem with technological creep, which sounds like a, you know, maybe some kind of computer programmer who's lurking in the bushes, is that even your 40-foot boat keeps getting outfitted with better and better technology, right? Because as you know how fast our technology increases, and so you can have the same sized boat that you had 10 years ago and the thing's like 10 times as deadly as it was because, you know, you're outfitted with the latest gear. And you can understand why the fishermen are driven to that, but, and it's another structural problem that adds to this general overall problem. The use of this sort of space age technology has had a pretty catastrophic consequence too. So we're doing something they call, let's see, fishing down the food chain. And so the way the food chains are set up is there's like, you know, plankton at the bottom, and they eat whatever they can get their little hands on, and they're often, they don't actually have hands. And, you know, they also use photosynthesis, and they're at the bottom of the food chain. There's billions of the things. I mean, whales eat them, some whales. And then, you know, little fish eat those, and then bigger fish eat the little fish, and bigger fish eat, you know, the medium-sized fish, and so on, all the way up to things like sharks and swordfish and tuna and human beings. Now, what we're basically doing, we tend to like the fish that are higher up on the food chain. So we tend to like the taste of predatory fish because they're hard-muscled. And now the problem with that is that the higher you are up in the food chain, the fewer there can be of you, in part because, you know, your primary sources of food are limited by this pyramid phenomena. as we've got better and better from a technological perspective at catching fish, what's happened is we are fishing down the food chain. We go from the great big fish at the top, like the sharks, about 70 million a year of which right now are killed for shark fin soup. And that's a lot of sharks, 70 million a year. You know, we're going to run out of sharks in no time flat if we keep things up at that rate. And so we fish down the food chain. We take the big predators first, and they're the most valuable fish, and then we go after what they go after, and then we go after what that fish has gone after, and we go out farther afield, and we go out into the deep ocean, and we find places that no one's fished before. But we're so damn good at it now that the time to exhaustion of the new fish species from the time we discover it is about 15 years. So we can discover a new species, which is often given, even if it's half inedible, it's given a real marketable name. We go after it with space-age technology and wipe it down to less than 85% of its previous numbers within 15 years. We're really deadly. And so, you know, as soon as we discover something, plus there's so many of us that the thing's in serious trouble in pretty much no time flat. There has been a global decline in the world's catch ever since about 1998 if you control for Red China's data, because the Chinese, from what I've been able to determine, tend to inflate their production numbers. I mean, that's a standard trick in totalitarian states, but even though we are switching to different species, and you know, we're pretty damn good at that, we haven't been able to halt the decline in overall catch, despite the fact that, you know, our technology has improved a lot and we're going after other species. And that's not a good thing. And the other thing that's really worth noting about fish, and this is one of the things that convinced me that there really was a problem, was you guys might know about the bet that was made by a Stanford biologist, Paul Ehrlich, and an economist whose name I don't remember, in about 1968. And Paul Ehrlich had written this book called The Population Bomb, where he predicted that, you know, we were all going to starve to death by the year 2000. And the economists always disagree with the biologists, because economists think we're real smart and can think our way out of everything. And, you know, so far they've been, you know, reasonably right. The biologists say, well, it's just a time thing. Malthus will win eventually. And who knows? But this economist bet Ehrlich that by the year 2000, commodity prices would have gone down instead of up, because Ehrlich's idea was everything's getting scarce, so from 1968 to the year 2000, all our commodities, which are somewhat scarce, are going to increase in price. Well, Ehrlich got stomped. The commodity prices plummeted between 1968 and 2000, so the economist had him, you know, beat him in no uncertain terms. But the one thing that didn't work out that way is seafood. I mean, things like cod used to be cheap, right? Seafood used to be cheap. Fish and chips, that was the cheapest thing you could buy on the menu. Well, it's not like that anymore. Seafood is expensive. And you know bloody well when something gets expensive that there actually isn't that much of it anymore. It's a really good marker. So, you know, we have global catch declining figures allied with pretty hard economic data that fish is a lot more expensive than it used to be. Plus, we're harvesting species that people wouldn't have even considered edible 100 years ago. I mean, 200 years ago, they were complaining about halibut and feeding it to their dogs. It's like, that's a high-quality fish by our standards. So there's no doubt that this is a real phenomenon. And there's other awful things that really are kind of difficult to tolerate when you read about them. And trawling is one of them. And here's a nice description of trawling. Basically what a trawl does is it's a huge net that's put behind a really big boat, and the net is weighted down and has rollers. There's a bunch of different kinds of them. It has rollers, and you put it on the bottom of the ocean. It sort of digs down to a depth of about 8 inches, and then you just drag the thing, and you drag it till the net fills up. And well, what does it fill up with? Well, whatever's down there. Coral. So especially now that they're fishing out the deeper areas of the ocean, all the coral's coming up, 300-pound chunks of it. Maybe they figure it takes 10,000 years to grow. And you know, that's habitat for fish. You run a trawler over an area, there's nothing left of it. It takes everything. You haul it up, what happens? You take your 10% of the damn fish that's in there that you want to eat, and you throw 90% back, because that's what you have to do by law. So the bycatch, so to speak, which is what you don't want, is 90%. Back it goes into the water. Now, remember I showed you the continental shelf. There's not that much of it. Well, we've trawled most of it. So, and that isn't stopping, and the trawlers are getting bigger. There's something they called a super trawler that was heading down to Australia, despite a lot of, public outcry, because the Australians are fairly sensitive about this sort of thing. They get bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, and that's partly because they're, because they can, and partly because they're chasing a diminishing resource. So you imagine what would happen if you, went through a nice bit of grassland or a national park with a net 300 feet high, and it was, dragged through by tractors. You just take everything, trees, deer, moose, birds, insects, everything. Pull out the things you can eat, let everything else rot. Jesus, if it was happening on land, people would be shorting out and running around in circles screaming, but it's happening at the bottom of the ocean and no one can see it. And it's not just happening once. There's lots of places in the North Sea which used to be clear and is no longer clear. It's muddy because of the trawling, at least in part, and because of the disturbance of the ocean floor. That place has been trawled like 3 or 4 times. So, obviously that's not going to work for very long. So here's a description. Picture a 2,000 horsepower trawler targeting plaice or sole, pulling a beam trawl mounted with rotating tickler chains across the featureless fans and gravels of the southern North Sea. The weighted trawl and its chains, designed to beat flat fish out of the sheltering mud, smashes up everything it does not catch, particularly the burrowing animals in the sediment, disturbing them at depths of up to 6 inches. European Union scientists have calculated that up to 16 pounds of marine animals are killed by beam trawls to produce 1 pound of marketable sole. Sea urchins, hermit crabs, brittle stars, and razor shells are killed or having part of their shells opened, made vulnerable to predators. Starfish tend to be the survivors, losing a leg or two but escaping the net. The winter in heavily trawled areas are usually crabs, which move in from other areas to eat damaged creatures, and worms that take over from the easily damaged bivalves. The scientists have concluded that most parts of the southern North Sea have been disturbed by a beam trawl at least once a year. The damage caused by fishing is estimated at 100,000 times greater than that of oil or gas exploration. So it's pretty much total devastation. So, that's kind of distressing. They estimate about 25% of the world's total catch is hauled in by trawls. So that just doesn't seem like a particularly intelligent way of going about things. Now, because the whole shelf is being trawled and there's not a hell of a lot left there, they've developed trawls that can go down to 2,000 meters. And 2,000 meters, that's getting to be 1.5 miles. That's close to the average depth of the deepest part of the ocean. Now, when you go way down in the ocean, there's not a lot there, as I said, but there are places on the ocean floor that are seamounts, so they sort of poke up, and when they poke up, currents come up them, and there's a lot of food on the seamount areas, and they can map those out really nicely now, and with the deep sea trawls, they just go over the seamounts and take everything that's there. So, and purse seams are also pretty devastating, especially when you combine them with spotting airplanes, because the spotting airplanes go off the coast and they find a school, and then the seines come in, and they take the whole school. So, that's also not really particularly a promising thing to be happening. So then the next problematic form of fishing seems to be maybe longline fishing. And so long lines are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They're very long fishing lines, and very long means up to 40 miles long, and with 30 hooks per mile, and so that's 1,200 hooks. And so, they're often catching the kind of fish that you'd like to eat, but they catch a lot of other things too, like tens of thousands of seabirds and tens of thousands of turtles and all sorts of things, and sharks and all sorts of things that, will eat anything that's on a baited hook. So the bycatch problem with longline fishing is also horrendous. So that's kind of, miserable to apprehend as well. And then, there's this thing I mentioned a little bit earlier about the Menhaden, and that was a very distressing book to read, because the Menhaden, because they're at the bottom of the food chain, down near where the little fish are there. Oh, and Menhaden, interestingly enough, are vegetarian. Most fish aren't vegetarian, but these guys are vegetarian, so that's what puts them at the bottom of the food chain. And they also take a lot of garbage out of the water because they're vegetarian. And so if there's algal blooms or something like that, which there often is because of nitrogen runoff from fertilizers from the land, then the Menhaden will go in there and clean it up. And then all the other fish will eat them, but they take the menhaden out to turn them into fertilizer. And as I said already, you know, that seems to be served at least in part by corruption in the East Coast states. They do the same thing in Denmark with this thing called the Sand Eel, and it's another one of these ugly little things that, you know, people wouldn't normally eat, but everything else does. And there's a lot of them. They're sort of like the menhaden. They breed like mad, but they've been catching those up a storm too, and often burning them for oil. So, well, and then there's us, you know, Canada. Canada is by no means an ecological paradise. Like, we like to pride ourselves on the idea that, you know, we're the sort of great north with our massive forests and our care for the environment. Most of that's pretty much rubbish. So, for example, we have a far smaller portion of our territory devoted to national parks than the Americans do, despite the fact that, 95% of the country is basically uninhabited. So that's a pretty shocking statistic. And the Americans have done a much better job at managing their fisheries than us. And, you know, we should have been shocked into, embarrassed action in 1992 when this happened. So, you know, the cod fishery off the Grand Banks had been there for 400 years, and it was really one of the world's remarkable treasures. And around before, I guess, 1978, the limit to national sovereignty, I think, was 7 miles. It's 4 or 7 miles, I can't remember exactly what. And, you know, the Spaniards and the Portuguese and lots of European fishing boats were in the Grand Banks fishing like mad, which of course they'd been doing for really almost 600 years. The Basques might have even got there before Christopher Columbus and not told anybody, because they like to have all those fish, you know, and Basques, they're pretty sneaky people. So anyways, you know, so the Canadian government made a big fuss about the fact that all these foreigners were out there taking out the cod, and they were part of the political force that got the national sovereignty zone extended to 200 miles offshore, so that Canada could manage its own cod stocks, and of course we'd do it responsibly. Well, the first thing that happened was the federal government modernized the Newfoundland fishing fleet and equipped it with, you know, really outstanding boats, and the second thing that happened was we took all the fish. And so you see what happened basically by 1992. So 2 billion fish, that's the estimate, that's a lot of fish, equal in weight to the entire Canadian population. And these cod, man, they were magnificent animals. They figured the ones that were there when the Europeans first came over to North America were something like 5 feet in length, more or less on average, and 3 feet around. These were big fish, you know, they're about the size of a person. And they came in massive, massive schools. And no one really knows why they haven't come back. There's a couple of hypotheses. One is, you know, fish in schools are like zebras. You don't see zebras, lone zebras roaming the Serengeti, you know. What you see is big clumps of zebras because they're herd animals. And they really are herd animals, which means the herd is their environment. And so they can't live away from a herd any less than people can. And it looks like cod are sort of like that, and other fish that live in schools. So, for example, one of the things that happens with cod schools is that, first of all, there's a lot of subspecies of cod, and we don't know how old the schools are, but some of the schools might be, who knows, 150,000 years old as superorganisms. And they seem to actually kind of know the ocean in which they swim as a collective unit. And so they know where to go eat, and they know where, you know, they know their habitat. And more importantly, the cod arrange themselves in schools so that the big cod are in the middle and the little cod are sort of outside. And then the predators pick off the little cod, but they're useless anyways because they're too young to breed. So the school is structured so that the big cod are protected. Second, when the cod mate, they actually use the school as a mating structure. So they organize their mating routines on the outside of the school structure. And so what that implies is that if you blow out the structure of the school, then the cod don't know what to do. And that's one potential reason they haven't really managed to come back. There's others, one being perhaps that if you really devastate a population, then maybe you change the ecological conditions of the environment, because it turns out that the way an ecosystem sets itself up is dependent to some degree on which creature gets there first, sort of which creature gets there in what order. And so if you wipe a population like the cod out low enough, then other animals move in to get the niche, and that's it, the cod can't come back. Now there's other theories too, you know, some of which have to do with ocean warming, but the point is, We've left the cod alone, kind of, because people are still allowed to fish a lot more for cod than you'd think. We've kind of left them alone for 20 years, and the consequences being pretty minimal, especially for an animal that, you know, fish, they lay a lot of eggs. It's not like they're not able to reproduce. They certainly know how to do that. So you know, you'd think we might have learned something from this, but it doesn't really appear that we did. And the other thing that really struck me as mind-boggling when I was going through this material was exactly Canada's record, which was so embarrassing that it was, again, it was like a personal blow. So I'm going to pretty much fold up with this. In 1992, which was about when the cod fishery collapsed, Canada promised to protect 20% of its oceanic territory. So the idea was to put aside chunks of oceanic territory, sort of like national parks, you know, where the animals that live there and the ecosystems would be protected so that they could come back, because, you know, fish come back pretty fast if you leave them alone. I read something very amusing about this very fact. You know how you heard, and maybe this is wrong, but I read it several places. You know how you heard that the whole Gulf of Mexico oil spill was such a catastrophe for fish? Yeah, well, there were more fish the year after the spill than the year before. And the reason for that is no one fished. So that's, you know, that's a pretty peculiar statistic, but it shows you two things. A, how many fish we take, and B, how damn fast the fish can come back if you leave them alone. The same thing happened in the North Sea in World War II. It was pretty much fished out before World War II, but no one was fishing during World War II because of German U-boats. And there was a lot of fish in the North Sea again after World War II, so if you leave the things alone for a while, they can come back. Canada promised to protect at least 20% of its oceanic territory by 2012, in writing, in a series of major international forums where Canada signed treaties in 1992, 2002, 2003, and 2005. So not only did we promised frequently and in writing. Less than 1% is currently protected, despite the fact that Canada has one of the longest international coastlines in the world and is also home to multiple, you know how there are ecological zones, because each little geographic area has its own peculiar characteristics. And so really what you need is, you need to set aside a protected area that are sort of representative of all these different ecological zones. And we have plenty of those ecological zones. Zero action. 1% of our oceanic territory is protected. That's it, and you can fish in 95% of that. So what we've done in the aftermath of the great cod catastrophe looks to me to be pretty much absolutely nothing. And what's weird about that, and at least in part, I mean, Canada is a complicated place, but the Australians have actually protected 20% of their oceanic area and have promised 20% more recently, and they actually seem to mean it, which is about a third as much territory as Australia actually has. So it is actually possible to set aside what are essentially national parks in the ocean and let the damn fish come back. And in principle, at least, that would also be good for the fishermen, because they can hang around the edges of the parks and, you know, the fish don't know where the boundaries are, and they can scoop them up once they breed again. So it's a rather cataclysmic and staggering saga of insane mismanagement, and it's not, there's not much point in pointing the finger one place or another, because, you know, it's pretty much everybody's fault. But it sure seems to me to be one of those things that you got to think about as being, it's hauntingly foolish, because all of that could be there, and why wouldn't that be a good thing? And, you know, if there was the political will in Canada, it could be done because other countries have done it. And for some reason, this is just not an on-the-radar issue, even though it's a real issue. This is actually happening. It's really not good. It's happening a lot. It's going to get worse. We're not going to have a lot of fish to eat. The oceans are going to be a pretty barren and dismal place, and we could actually do something about it. So that's why I decided to do this talk, even though I don't really know a lot about the oceans, you know. It seems to me that this situation, it's always dangerous talking about things when you sort of know something and mostly you don't, but it seems to me that the situation with the oceans is so obviously not good that you actually don't have to be an expert to notice. And so, what can be done about it? Well, you know, I think the marine protected areas are a good idea. We have examples of countries doing it and it seems to work. Everyone's already figured out that it's a pretty good idea with regards to national parks on land. No one seems to really dispute that, although, you know, we could have some more national parks. So, what's the big problem about having them out in the ocean, you know, and to preserve some of the coastline and to let the fish have a fighting chance, unless we don't want to have them around. You know, and what we're facing in some ways, well, they're starting to process jellyfish for food. Because as we get rid of the fish, the whole ecosystem starts to turn back to what it was like 400 million years ago, before there were any fish. And there were lots of invertebrates, and you know, we could have an ocean full of invertebrates, and I hear they press up into hockey puck sized discs pretty nicely. They don't have a lot of taste, and I suppose you'd have to be a pretty good chef to make them edible, but we probably won't run out of jellyfish during our life. So, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to pen a note to your MP or to the Minister of Fisheries, and just note that, you know, destroying a resource that we could actually enjoy aesthetically and practically, that destroying that seems to be not in anybody's best interest, and that it's actually happening at a pretty rapid rate. So I guess that's partly what Finn is aiming at, and partly why I decided to do this talk, and also to get involved and to invite Dr. Hansen, who really knows what he's talking about, who's going to speak next. So we should take a 10-minute break, and then we'll return and have Dr. Hansen speak. There'll be a question and answer period at the end of Dr. Hansen's talk. Thank you.